Hey, good morning, everybody. Welcome back to this edition of Quarantine Collections. My name is Travis Gilbert. I'm the Educator and Collections Coordinator here at the Old Baldy Foundation. And I'm very glad that you can be joining us this morning because we are going to talk about one of my favorite characters in the story of Bald Head Island, and that is Governor or General Benjamin Smith. This island, often you hear referred to as Smith Island or Smith Island Complex, gets its name from General Smith or Governor Smith and his family members who owned this island throughout much of the 1700s. But before we get started in there, if you're out there listening, give us a shout out in the comments. I'd love to know where you're listening from and what your connection is to Bald Head Island. And if you have any questions or would like us to elaborate on something, give us a holler in those comments as well, and we will get back to you. So Benjamin Smith, I keep a picture of him right here at my desk. This is really the only oil painting or the only portrait we have of Governor Smith. And Benjamin Smith had a long lineage. That's how he becomes connected to Bald Head Island. You see, General or Governor Smith's great-grandfather, great-great-grandfather, was Thomas Smith II, who was an first landgrave, one of the first landgraves or large landowners of Carolina. That's before we're North and South Carolina, and was a governor of South Carolina in the late 1600s. And his son, the second landgrave, Thomas Smith II, is who purchases Bald Head Island in the year 1713. Tradition says to evade taxes, which were higher in South Carolina. Now, these Smiths, Thomas Smith II and the first, were from an area called Goose Creek. It's north of modern-day Charleston, and it was the center of life for rice planters in the low country of South Carolina. Most, if not all, of these men had immigrated into South Carolina from Barbados. They were the leftovers of the Barbadians who attempted to settle the lower Cape Fear River in the 1660s, but failed. That's that first Charlestown settlement that was near the modern location of Town Creek, where it empties out into the Cape Fear River. Of course, by 1667, that first Charlestown fails here on the banks of the Cape Fear. They try again down there in South Carolina in 1670, and it is from that second Charlestown where the Ashley and the Cooper Rivers meet to dump out into the Atlantic Ocean that Benjamin Smith's ancestors find their success in the crop of rice and, of course, the labor of all the enslaved peoples that were working those rice fields. And I want to give a shout out. Today is the 350th anniversary of Charlestown down in South Carolina. So happy birthday, Charlestown. I hope to be reunited with you very, very soon. So I see Phil's listening. Good morning, Phil. It's good to hear from you. Happy Saturday. And Ann, good morning, Travis. Happy to see you this morning as well, Ann. Thank you for listening. And Tony Britt Kirkengard is listening. Good morning, Tony, from downtown Wilmington. It's good to hear from you. So that was his lineage. And again, it is Thomas Smith II, the second landgrave, who purchases Bald Head Island in 1713. And upon his death in 1738, the second landgrave, Thomas Smith, gives his sons these land holdings. Those sons end up selling modern-day Bald Head Island to a gentleman named William Dry. William Dry can trace his lineage or ancestry into South Carolina, and he came to the Cape Fear River in the late 1720s and early 1730s for economic opportunity. South Carolina was becoming overpopulated. The land was getting gobbled up by these planters, and there was much more freedom here in North Carolina on the banks of the Cape Fear. And also the Goose Creek planters were kind of rebels, if you will. They very much rebelled against the proprietary government. So before we were a royal before we were a royal colony, we were under the authority of 8 lords proprietors that were given this area of Carolina by King Charles II as a reward for supporting the royalist forces during the English Civil Wars. And when Charles II regains the English throne, he gives these 8 lords proprietors this area of Carolina, and they taxed heavily the settlers of Carolina, mostly from Barbados, men like the Smiths and men like the Dries. In addition to high taxes or rents, the first forms of government under this proprietary governorship in Carolina were not as democratic as you and I would come to understand or know Carolina. So not only were there grievances towards the proprietary government because of the high taxes, also because this undemocratic spirit in Carolina. So William Dry left this agitated Goose Creek area of South Carolina and found economic opportunity and more liberties on the banks of the Cape Fear River. And it is William Dry who ends up purchasing Bald Head Island from the Smiths. And who do you think Benjamin Smith marries in 1777 amidst the American Revolution at St. Philip's Anglican Church in downtown Charleston? None other than William Dry's daughter, Sarah Dry. So the land of Bald Head Island is first purchased by the second Thomas Smith. It goes to his children. His children sell it to William Dry. And then when Benjamin Smith marries William Dry's only daughter, and William Dry dies in 1781, this land that we know today as Bald Head Island goes back into the Smith family. And since Benjamin Smith was the executor of William Dry's will on behalf of his wife, Sarah Dry Smith, he ends up owning Bald Head Island once again, bringing this island back into the fold of the Smith family, where it will remain until Benjamin Smith dies in 1826. Good morning, Jessica. It's great to hear from you. So Benjamin Smith, in his early years, he was educated in Philadelphia. He was born around 1756, 1757. We're not quite sure when, somewhere around in there, in Charlestown. He is educated in Philadelphia, and he's about 20 years old when the American Revolution breaks out. So, of course, with many 20-year-olds at that time in American history, he enlists in the army or the militia. Some suggest that Benjamin Smith was an aide-de-camp to George Washington during the retreat from Manhattan and New York City in 1776, in the summer of 1776. Unfortunately, many historians, including myself, do not agree with Benjamin Smith saying that he was an aide-de-camp. And it all goes back to 1791, after the American Revolution. George Washington visits Wilmington on his southern tour as President of the United States. He is served breakfast at General Smith's plantation that we're going to speak about. And reportedly, General Smith and General Washington, or President Washington at this time, that didn't seem like they knew one another. When President Washington arrives for breakfast at General Smith's plantation, doesn't seem like they know one another. And you would think that President Washington would be extremely intimate with General Smith. if they served as with one another so intimately during the American Revolution. And not only during the American Revolution, one of the most trying times for George Washington during the American Revolution. Additionally, George Washington was very close and very intimate with what he called his military family. George Washington never had children. He had children that Mary Custis had to a previous marriage. So because of him not being a father, or at least a biological father, George Washington became very close with these men, these teenagers that he surrounded himself with during the American Revolution. And even after the American Civil War, George Washington corresponded with these men that served as his loyal aides during the American Revolution. He rewarded these men's loyalty during the American Revolutions with political appointments after the war. And we don't have any letters between George Washington and Benjamin Smith. And Benjamin Smith did not receive any political appointments from George Washington. So I think it's highly unlikely that our dear friend Governor Smith or General Smith served as an aide-de-camp to George Washington during the American Revolution. But what we do know is that he served in the South Carolina militia in the 1780s during the siege of Charlestown, South Carolina in 1780. We know because he was very much embarrassed by his role during the siege of Charlestown. The British had attempted to take Charlestown in 1776, and they failed. When they returned in the late 1779 into 1780, they were successful in capturing Charlestown after a siege. And the siege was lifted just a few days after General or Governor Smith writes a letter to his newlywed. Sarah Dry, recall, now Sarah Dry Smith. She's left in North Carolina. Benjamin Smith clearly misses his wife, and he writes a letter from behind the Continental Army's lines, and the letter shows very poor morale. It suggests that the Continentals are on the verge of starving. It says that they are surrounded by the British troops. It says that the Continental Army's commander, named General Lincoln, was on the verge of surrendering, that their position was untenable. And Benjamin Smith gives this letter to be delivered to his wife to Edward Rutledge, who is a member of the Continental Congress and a leading figure during the Revolution. Well, Edward Rutledge was captured by the British when he left the Continental lines. And when he was captured, the British came across Benjamin Smith's letter to his newlywed wife, and they used that letter as a propaganda campaign to convince the other Continental soldiers stuck within Charlestown, hey, you need to surrender. They do the old-fashioned way. It always makes me think of the Cold War. They literally make copies of Benjamin Smith's letter, put them into a shell, and fire that shell into the Continental's lines so the leaflets or the letters scatter amongst the Continental troops. And when the Continental troops read what Benjamin Smith wrote, it plummets their morale. They're saying, oh, why would we continue to put our lives on stake? This is, fruitless. This is not going to end well. We've got to surrender. And General Lincoln surrenders the Continental soldiers and the city of Charlestown shortly thereafter. Very embarrassing to Benjamin Smith. So, of course, he's paroled. He returns to North Carolina, where upon the marriage of Benjamin Smith and Sarah Dry, a few years previous, Benjamin Smith is given a gift of a plantation called Blue Banks. It's on the northwest Cape Fear River in modern-day Brunswick County. You think Navassa, north and west of modern-day Navassa. And that is where this newlywed couple lives during Benjamin Smith's parole, because he can't fight anymore. He's been captured, so on his word, he's going to tell the British officers, the British troops, I'm not going to fight anymore, I'm going to go home. And shortly thereafter, Benjamin Smith's father-in-law, William Dry, dies. And since William Dry only had 2 daughters, and the one daughter passed away very early, Benjamin Smith's newlywed wife, Sarah Dry Smith, she ends up inheriting all her father's land, all her father's slaves, and of course, with her being a woman in the 18th century, she defers to her husband, Benjamin Smith, to manage the will and to execute the will and to inherit the land and the enslaved peoples. So upon William Dry's death in 1781, Benjamin Smith becomes one of the wealthiest men in the state of North Carolina, and he was about my age. He was very, very young. In fact, in the 1790 census, the first census of the United States, Benjamin Smith is the largest slave owner in the entire state of North Carolina, owning an amazing amount of enslaved peoples, 221 enslaved peoples. And most of them are centered on the new seat or the new house that Benjamin Smith creates at a place called Belvedere. So upon his father-in-law's death, the new family, Sarah and Benjamin, moved from Blue Banks, and they moved to this plantation called Belvedere, which is today where the causeway goes across from Wilmington, across Eagles Island, and dumps out into Leland. That is where Belvedere is. He goes to that area for two reasons. First of all, before there's a Cape Fear Memorial Bridge, before there's a causeway, there is a ferry. You are in downtown Wilmington, you get on a ferry, and the ferry takes you across to Eagles Island, and then you hike your way across the swamps of Eagles Island, and then you get on a second ferry that takes you across what we know today as the Brunswick River, and dumps you out into Belleville or Leland today. I think where, like, if you're familiar with that area, where the McDonald's and the Taco Bell and the Piggly Wiggly's is, and the Food Lion, that's where you're going to get dumped out. So before ferries or bridges were a municipal or state kind of facilitated infrastructure, the state would license private individuals to operate these pieces of infrastructure, and of course they would reap the benefits. And this is one of the most highly trafficked places in all of colonial and early republic North Carolina, because the King's Highway that traveled the eastern seaboard from Charlestown the whole way up into New England, well, it crossed the Cape Fear River on this ferry system. It's modern day Route 17, mostly. So anybody traveling north and south across North Carolina's coastal plain had to get on that ferry that Mr. Smith now owned. So he's going to become a very rich man off of this ferry system. Additionally, the second reason he chooses Belvedere in modern-day Belleville or Leland is because it is ripe for the production of rice, which is becoming the principal cash crop in the lower Cape Fear region. With those 221 enslaved peoples that he is registering on the 1790 census, he is going to begin cultivating hundreds of acres of rice crop in Eagles Island and on the western banks of the Cape Fear River in modern-day Leland. The rice was a highly laborious product. You needed it to be in an area where the tidal creeks and the tidal rivers at high tide would push water into the fields to flood them, and then at low tide the water would naturally seep or drain itself back into the river. So Eagles Island and Belvedere was perfect for that production of rice. And it is at Belvedere that Benjamin Smith in 1791 hosts George Washington on that famed southern tour throughout the southern colonies. Eventually, Benjamin Smith would inherit Orton Plantation, which is one of the most famous and celebrated plantations in the lower Cape Fear region. And that is where he would move from Belvedere in the early 19th century to Orton and make that the seat of his house and kind of run operations from there. Additionally, he would have a house in Newbern. He would have a house in downtown Wilmington, two very urban areas that Benjamin Smith frequented, so he had homes there. He also, in 1792, as a member of the state legislature, sponsors a bill to create the town of Smithville. Of course, named in his honor. That's going to smooth the gears a little bit. It's going to entice Benjamin Smith to introduce that legislation. Hey, Joshua Potts and some other area, Brunswick County locals, they say, we want to build a town at around Fort Johnston, which is modern-day Southport we're talking about. Would you sponsor the legislation? And by the way, we'll name the town after you. So it's perfect, of course. So in 1792, as a member of the lower house, or the General Assembly, the House of Commons we call it, at this time in North Carolina history, Benjamin Smith sponsors the legislation to create the town of Smithville, named in his honor, and he has a summer home in Smithville. Additionally, in the early 1790s, he creates a beach house called Sea Castle here on Bald Head Island. Of course, that he inherits from his father-in-law, William Dry. We don't know where Sea Castle was on Bald Head Island. We have a map by Joshua Potts who depicts Sea Castle north and slightly northwest of the original lighthouse. The lighthouse that predates Old Baldy. So we're not sure where Sea Castle was, but it would be somewhere around where I'm sitting. Somewhere around modern-day Old Baldy. Fortunately, of course, since it was built in the late 18th century, there's not going to be much left, if anything left at all. And it certainly wasn't a castle, folks. It was a small beach cottage. But certainly a beach home. So lots of property, a very, very wealthy man. He serves in the state legislature, as first in the House of Commons and then as a state senator. And then in 1810 to 1811, he is governor of the state of North Carolina. Good morning, Emmeline and Dan. Who doesn't love history? I love history. I know you all love history. Seems like we have a few listeners out there that's loving history. Give us a shout out if you're listening. If you haven't, reached out, I'd love to hear from you all out there. Let us know where you're listening from and what your connection to Bald Head Island is. So a long legislative history. He was also a magistrate in the court of Brunswick County. And there are two things that I think that Benjamin Smith leaves behind in his legislative record. And then a third thing that's kind of slightly related. So as we're wrapping up here, let me talk about it. First of all, as a state assemblyman, as a lawmaker, he is the man who helps usher through North Carolina's ratification of the federal government. Did you know that North Carolina was the second to the last state to ratify the federal Constitution? We take for granted now that everybody seems to like the Constitution, abides by the Constitution. We kind of glorify it, this wonderful document for Western civilization. But at the time, in the late 1780s, North Carolina was not on board. One after one, these states ratify the federal Constitution. And in fact, George Washington is elected as our first president, and North Carolina has not joined the Union yet. We're still lagging behind because there is this deep-seated reservation against allowing the federal government to assume all these powers superseding the state government. So we have a convention that meets in Hillsborough in 1788. Benjamin Smith is a member of that constitutional convention. They fail in ratifying the Constitution at this point. They meet again in 1789 in Fayetteville. Benjamin Smith again attends, and he is the man that seconds the motion to ratify the federal Constitution on behalf of the state of North Carolina. The man that seconded the motion to do that. And of course that passes, so we ratify the Constitution in 1789. So I think he really gave us that. That's a huge legacy he left behind. The second legacy in his years as a lawmaker is he helps usher in the lighthouse history here on Bald Head Island. So in the 1780s, in 1784, as a member of the lower house, Benjamin Smith votes to raise a tax to 6 pence per ton of all cargo entering the Cape Fear River, and that tax is accumulating in an account that is earmarked to create a lighthouse, and that is all prefaced by Benjamin Smith telling the legislature that he is going to donate 10 acres on his island near Sea Castle, his beach house. And that all goes through. Not only does he help construct that original lighthouse, but when they tear it down in 1813, Benjamin Smith again donates more land and helps find a location for the construction of Old Baldy in 1817. He's an older man at this point. Now, the last piece of legacy in his history as a lawmaker, and it's kind of related to his history as a lawmaker, is he's one of the original trustees for the University of North Carolina in Wilmington. And Benjamin Smith donates some 20,000 acres of western land in today we know it as Tennessee. Today is known as Tennessee. But Benjamin Smith inherits this land, and then he bequeaths that land to this newly established University of North Carolina in order for the university to sell the land and reap the benefits. And Benjamin Smith serves as a trustee for a very long time. In fact, Smith Hall is named after Benjamin Smith on the campus at Chapel Hill. So quite a legacy for the man. How's it all end, and how am I tying it back into our archives? Well, it doesn't have a very happy ending, unfortunately. Benjamin Smith, he becomes a security for a bond for Colonel Reed. He's collector of the Port of Wilmington in the early 19th century. And Colonel Reed, unfortunately, defaults on his loans and his bonds. And since Benjamin Smith and his wife Sarah were a security for that bond, now the financial obligations are resting on him. And this begins a slow and then very quick descent into becoming a debtor. Benjamin Smith is unable to come up with the money to pay off this bond. In addition to having this financial obligation, Benjamin Smith's plantations and his luxurious lifestyle end up really costing him a lot of money. And slowly but surely he can't pay it off. He tries to liquidate assets. He continues to take on contracts with the federal government to use as enslaved people to build, let's say, like the fort at Fort Johnston. It was burned by Patriot troops during the American Revolution, and during the early Republic years, the federal government tried to rebuild the fort in modern-day Southport today. So he's just getting these contracts so he can get the money and buy time. He tries to convince the federal government to buy Bald Head Island, to use its wood, its live oak, in order to create naval warships, the birth of the United States Navy. He tries to really convince the War Department and the Navy Department, buy this island for me, buy this island for me. There's so many natural resources you can use here. He's never successful in that. And when he dies in 1826, he dies penniless. Absolutely penniless. Now, tradition states that when Benjamin Smith died, he was so broke, and that customs or laws at the time in 1826 when Benjamin Smith dies say that if you died in debt, your creditors, the people you owed money, could claim your body and hold your body hostage from your loved ones until your debts or your estate were settled. Tradition says that when Benjamin Smith dies in 1826, his wife Sarah and his loved ones were so fearful that this would occur, that the sheriff would come and collect the body on behalf of the creditors, that his burial was shrouded in mystery. It was kind of a secret. They float him from Orton, where he dies, into Smithville, or modern-day Southport, and they bury him in an unmarked grave so his creditors cannot find where he is. Tradition continues to say that after the body was exhumed, they were only able to identify Benjamin Smith's body because he had fought a duel earlier in his life, and the musket ball from the duel was still lodged in Benjamin Smith's ribcage when he died in 1826. You got it, right? Emmeline. And I'm like, Thomas Jefferson. And I love the fact that Thomas Jefferson and John Adams died on the same day, and that being 4th of July. And what's John Adams say? His last words are supposedly, Thomas Jefferson lives, because they were best friends, but they were also kind of complete opposites of the political spectrum. And I digress. But back to Benjamin Smith. Yes, Emmeline. So he dies. The creditors want his body. His family members and his friends secretly bury Benjamin Smith in an unmarked grave in Smithville, or modern-day Southport. And years later, when they exhume his body for a proper burial, the only way they're able to identify Benjamin Smith's body is because the musket ball lodged in his rib cage from that duel fought previously. And I know I'm running out of time, but it's really interesting. Let me just read a primary source of this duel from General Joseph Gardner Smith, who served in this area in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So it says, on the anniversary of the Battle of Fort Moultrie in South Carolina, the 28th of June, the meeting of General Smith and Captain Roger Moore took place in South Carolina, not far from the seashore, where stands the boundary house of the two states, the line running through the center of the hall of the entrance, where he was held partly of some North Carolina officers sent in pursuit, a party occupying the south side of the line of the hall and thus beyond their jurisdiction. So North Carolina banned duels in this time. Banned duels. It was illegal here after a duel in New Bern that and did not end very well. Anyway, so on the South Carolina North Carolina border, along modern-day Route 17, the King's Highway, there was this house or this tavern called the Boundary House. And legend says that the south side there was an entrance hall that went down the middle of the building, the Boundary House. And on the left, those parlors or rooms were on the in South Carolina. And then on the right, the left side rooms were in North Carolina. So Benjamin Smith and the Moore, when they're going to have this duel, they got to go to South Carolina where it's legal. Everything's legal in South Carolina. Myrtle Beach, right? Horry County. That's a bad joke. Anyway, they go in there and the North Carolina officials can't get to them because they go on the right side of the Boundary House where dueling is legal. So they say that these are... Major Captain Duncan Moore, or Major Duncan Moore is Roger Moore's second. Joseph Gardner Smith, who's writing this account, is Benjamin Smith's second assistants. There are two doctors or surgeons that went there. So at the second fire, he says, at the second shot, General Smith receives his antagonist's ball in his side and fell. The surgeons, Dr. Scott and Griffin, conveyed General Smith to Smithville by water, while I hastened to Belvedere and in a chair conveyed Mrs. Smith in the night to the fort through one of the storms of lightning and rain that often rage in the Carolina summer. On this occasion, the lightning destroyed two trees, one on either side of the road, apparently one flash, and for a moment blinding us. But the anxiety of the wife was superior to the alarm, and the lady found her husband quite cheerful at Fort Johnston, with the ball lodged near the left shoulder blade. The party proceeded to Wilmington, where the general recovered after a few weeks' confinement. Family rancor with these cousins was a cousin duel. So they were cousins, by the way. Anyway, it was in the shoulder, not the rib cage, pardon me. I think Andrew Jackson was the rib cage. But long story short, so that musket ball was still in General Smith's shoulder when he died. They buried the body in this unmarked grave, and then when they re-exhumed the body years afterwards, when the state was settled, they know that General Smith's that is his body, because the musket ball is still lodged there. And they take that body to St. Philip's Anglican Church, where it is now at Fort Anderson, Brunswick-town Fort Anderson State Historic Site. And that's where he rests alongside his father-in-law, William Dry, and his mother-in-law. His wife eventually rests there. His wife's sister, who died very, very young, rests there. Colonial governors, Moors, King Roger Moore that settled this area, he rests beside these figureheads of early Lower Cape Fear River history. Now that is all legend. Now we do know it is weird. Benjamin Smith has a grave in the old Smithville Burying Grounds in Headstone, but he's not there. He also has a grave at St. Philip's Anglican Church. We think he's there. But it's all tradition. It's all legacy. How do we know? It's almost like that saying, if it's too good to be true, it is. And this story, it always seemed to me, is like, okay, well, this is a lovely story, but it seems to be legendary. I mean, it has a little bit of everything. It has a duel. It has a secret burial. It has, early forensics. Do they really claim cadavers to settle loans? It seems like a lot to me. Well, what do you know? In our archives, in our Benjamin Smith files, we have a piece of parchment. And we have lots of different piece letters that describe how they settled the estate and how Benjamin Smith's assets were liquidated through a sheriff's sale at the Brunswick County Courthouse in the 1820s. Well, at the beginning of this paper says, "To the Sheriff of New Hanover County, greetings. You are hereby commanded to take the body of Benjamin Smith and him safely keep so that you may have him before the justices of the County Court of Pleas and Quarter Session." And this is dated after he dies. You are hereby commanded to take the body of Benjamin Smith. So perhaps, according to this primary resource, this is true. It's not legend. It is indeed fact. So to wrap this up, a great find in our archives, and we take very good care of this piece of parchment. The legacy of Benjamin Smith, an amazing mind, contributed much to what we know as North Carolina today. But forewarning to those, he became too empowered, too sure of himself, and he ends up losing it all and dying penniless and dying with the sheriff searching for his body. That is the dear legacy of Benjamin Smith. And of course, upon his death and the liquidation of his assets, the island leaves the Smith family, never to return. But that is where we get this idea of Smith Island and Smith Island Complex. So thank you for joining us as I preached about Benjamin Smith. He's one of my high horses. I really like this character in American history and North Carolina history. So we will be bringing you an edition of Touring with Travis this afternoon. It's our last virtual program of the week. And then we'll be back on Tuesday for more virtual programming. We're going to do this for a little while longer, and then we were going to be transitioning into what comes next for the Old Baldy Foundation in terms of operations and in terms of programming. But we'll be with you for at least a few more weeks as the dust settles and we get a clearer picture of how the Old Baldy Foundation, how Bald Head Island, how our state and how our nation are going to move forward from these distressing and terrible times. So thank you all for joining us this morning for this edition of Quarantine Collections. On behalf of the Old Baldy Foundation, we sincerely hope that your family is still healthy, that you all are trying to remain positive out there. We thank all our essential employees, all our doctors and nurses, our truck drivers, our grocery store workers, our pharmacists, our laboratory workers, our researchers, everybody that's out there doing their part to alleviate some of the pain this country is experiencing right now. And to all of you who have been social distancing and listening to the directives of our public officials, it seems that our endeavors are working, and things are beginning to seem a little positive. We've got a long ways to go with many more sacrifices to be made on behalf of everybody. But things are beginning to take a turn, and that is something to look forward to, because we sincerely look forward to the day that we can invite you all back to Baldy Island and we can be interacting and doing these programs in person. So we'll see you this afternoon. You all take care and enjoy your Saturday. Thanks.